indentured servants or whatever you want to call them. Yes. Okay. So there was a way that that indentured or indentured servant at one point in time could also have access to a sexually intimate relationship with if they wanted to, of course. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So are you saying that
but for present day, because one of the higher objectives of Sharia was to get rid of this institution anyways, and that's been mentioned by a lot of people like Ghazali and many big scholars that say that the objective of Sharia was to get rid of slavery. Now that that's
what authority do they have to make that claim?
They looked at the Quranic discourse. So for example, they looked at the fact that in the Surah At-Tawbah, chapter 9 of the Quran, it says إِنَّمَا الصَّدَقَاتُ لِلْفُقَرَاءِ وَالْمَسَاكِينَ, and it's basically, it talks about who the sadaqah or the zakat in this verse is applicable to, and one of them is وَفِي الرِّقَابِ, and those who the right hand possesses, like the slaves. And so therefore, if it's part of zakat, the zakat is meant to be until the day of judgment, then it makes sense to say that that's an objective of Sharia. So that is an extrapolation.
So could you explain a bit more?
Yeah, so of the 8 categories of the people that were to be given zakat in the Quran, there's 8 categories. Of them are masakin or fuqara, the poor people and the people that don't have enough money to live, and the ones who non-Muslims but could potentially embrace Islam if they were to be given incentives, which is amongst of them, وَفِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, the ones in the path of Allah, which means war, yeah, defensive war, offensive, all those different kinds of war. That's one of the things in there. Anyways, I'm not going to go through all of them, but the idea is one of them is وَفِي الرِّقَابِ, which is slavery.
Yes, so slaves should receive zakat.
No, it's saying that you should take her money. Say for example you have £100 million that comes in through zakat. A portion of it must be used to free the slaves.
Is that what it says in the Quran?
Yes, it does say that. It says وَفِي الرِّقَابِ.
But the hadith that you mentioned in
وَفِي الرِّقَابِ.
What about
it's better to give your slave to your family than your friend.
Yeah,
وَفِي الرِّقَابِ.
That's a hadith.
Yeah, so وَفِي الرِّقَابِ, which means that you have to use the zakat to free the slave. Okay. You have to not just the slave, any slave, free them.
Okay.
So
what about taking new slaves?
So it's got about now.
About any war, according to Islamic principles.
Yeah. So now the scholars have said, since the maqsad, which is the objective of Sharia, has been fulfilled, which is because if you think about it, you're going to be spending money to free them. Yes. Are we agreeing here? We're going to be spending money. The GDP of the country is going to go to freedom. Yes.
Isn't that like one of the potential ways? I mean, I haven't looked into this piece.
No. The Quran. This is the Quran. Okay. The Quran says you have to use money to free slaves. Okay. So it makes sense.
Freeing slaves isn't fard, though, is it?
It is fard. It is obligatory because these are the 8 compulsory, obligatory things wherein which zakat is applicable.
Okay. Why didn't Mohammed and his companions free all their slaves if it's fard?
No, you're confusing 2 things. I'm saying that there was a program in place, an Islamic program, which dedicated money, yes, a percentage of the country's GDP in order to free slaves. Okay, now that doesn't mean that abolition will happen overnight, in the same way as it did with intoxicants. And that, by the way, didn't even happen overnight as well. So why is it that the Quran didn't come and say, well, stop drinking straight away? Because people are addicted to intoxicants, right? Yeah. And also because there's an economic aspect of it as well, which is when we saw it happen in America, it's a problem. Yeah, you can't just say let's take this aspect out of it. So, the Islamic program was the Quran says of the 8 things which are used to for redistribution, one of those 8 is the freeing of slaves.
I see.
So in other words, it's not.
So zakat is to be used for this purpose.
Okay, that's one of the 8 reasons why it should be used.
Okay, but there's still a problem that if the Quran sanctions taking new slaves in war, then you're going to be freeing some slaves at the same time as taking new slaves in war.
So
the Quran says, let me give you, the Quran says like let them enjoy saying is that it was like standard practice in Muhammad's lifetime, and
Yes.
the
Yeah, there's
rightly
no-
guided caliphs to
you're-
take new slaves during
Yes.
war.
Yes. So these prisoners of the prisoners of war, the taking of prisoners of war. Don't forget that was done in a context where the enemy would have done the same thing. Yeah. So it's always contextual, and that's why it's important. If the enemy is taking women and children as prisoners of war, then in that context the whole paradigm shifts. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? So in the context,
I don't know what's the direct
if
evidence
the
of
enemy,
that?
well, I'm telling you now, because if
Sorry,
the enemy has decided that this institution of slavery, for example, of taking prisoners of war and then feeding them back into a system of slavery, if that has been abolished, then the whole mas'ala, the whole jurisprudential issue is a changed one. You see what I'm trying to say?
So, like, well, but I don't know what the direct evidence is for a
There is
scholar.
no- okay, there's
for,
a-
what-
one is
if,
the Baqarah, which is-
let's say I'm a scholar and I give a fatwa and I say because other nations aren't doing slavery anymore, we won't do it anymore either.
Yeah, there
And
are some that say that.
Yeah, so like,
Yes.
but where do you get that? Where is that a kind of a necessity according to Islam? If kind of when did the Muhammad or the like subsequent caliphs ever do that and say we'll only do this action because the enemies are doing it?
The Quran says that. So the Quran, there's a verse in the Quran which says that, and the punishment of those who do, inflict punishment is a punishment like it. So in other words, if the enemy is doing X, yes, if the enemy is doing X, and that thing doesn't contradict, let's say, some fundamental right, nothing really, then it's a different mas'ala. If the enemy is not going to do it to you,
So
if
is
the-
that Quran verse? Or?
yeah, it's a Quranic verse. So the Quranic verse is on Baqarah. It says that if the enemy does this, you can do this to them as well.
Okay, what can we look at that?
Yeah, we can look at that. By the way, some terrorists have used this verse, and that is, by the way, just to let you know something. That's one of the adilla, or one of the evidences that Al-Qaeda use. They say, well, hold on, the enemy is killing our innocents, so let's kill their innocents. But we say that the problem with that reasoning, with this particular mas'ala or that particular issue, is that Prophet Muhammad has already said you can't kill the women and children. You see what I'm trying to say? So you can't use a general ruling to abrogate a specific one. You can only use a specific ruling, not to abrogate it, but to do takhsis. In other words, to elucidate on what the general ruling is.
Would it be fair to say that you are using analogy or qiyas to say that because of this Quranic kind of teaching, it should be applied to the issue of slavery?
No, it's not, because qiyas you have to have maqis and maqis alayhi, yeah? So you have to have that which is the hukum, and then you have to have the illah, and then you have to, which is the effective causative reasoning, and then you have to implement it on something else. But when there's two mafhums of a verse. A mafhum mantuq and a mafhum mukhalafa. A mafhum mantuq of the verse is the implied meaning of it. I'm talking about here the general understanding of the verse, unless there's a mukhassis. A mukhassis means a specifier. So for example, in the case of killing the innocents, yes? Killing the innocents, this verse, had it been the only thing that was in existence, then the Al-Qaeda people would have an argument. Because they will say, well, they're killing our innocents. The verse says we can do to them what we do to them, what they do to us. Therefore, we're going to kill their innocents. However, you have clear verses in the Quran and the Sunnah which says you can't kill the non-combatant. Man qatala mu'ahad, the hadith says, man qatala mu'ahadan lam yarih ra'ihat al-jannah. Whoever kills a non-combatant non-believer, he will never smell the fragrance of paradise. Or the verse where it says, la yanhakum Allah an ladhina lam yuqatilukum fi dini. Chapter 60 verse 8, no, you can't kill the people who don't kill you back from.
Same verse, Surah Baqarah, verse 190, 190, was the same verse that it says, attack them back how they attacked you. It's the same verse that says, do not transgress. And the word transgress,
And don't transgress.
and
Very
the word
good, yeah.
transgress, means
ولا تعتدوا.
that
I
you
don't
cannot.
transgress the bounds. So,
Same verse
so that transgression is mentioned. So the question is, if you have a situation where the institution of slavery is effectively illegal in all of the other enemy territories, can you introduce it? That's the question. Now, this question, by the way, we asked the ulama this question. We asked the scholars this Saudi Arabia, and I've seen some Hanafi ulama answer as well. All of them, the majority of them say no. You cannot reintroduce it because one of the maqasid of Sharia, one of the objectives of Sharia was to get rid of it. Some of them said yes. So because they said, well, the Prophet used the same reasoning you said. Some of them said that actually, since the Prophet did it, and he put into war, prisoners of war, women and children, then you cannot abrogate this, you cannot say it doesn't exist. However, my own position on the matter is with the majority, because I'll tell you why. It makes sense if there's a maqsad of Sharia, which is an objective of Sharia, which almost everyone agrees that freeing slaves was the maqsad of Sharia. And by the way, inshallah,
I don't know what that means.
oh, sorry. You don't go against the objective which you've already, which there has been progress in achieving. So, if you read the book called Al-Muwafaqat,
I mean, I wouldn't agree that there's like it's established that there's this objective to end slavery.
But no,
because
but
it seems to me that like
that's
kind
what
of
jurists
they're
say.
taking in.
No.
But like, I mean,
That's what the jurists, Al-Ghazali says this. Many of the jurists of like, and remember these are medieval jurists that came way before the modern era, before liberalism or anything. It's not an apologetic approach. This is the approach of medieval scholars who looked at the nusus, the textual evidences, and came to this conclusion based on what all of the nusus or the textual evidences are pushing us towards.
many of those scholars bought slaves themselves, though.
Yes, they bought slaves, but remember, they did so in an area where there was already slavery. There was no abolition.
Okay.
Yes. So we're talking about today. That's what you said, right? We were talking about today's context. So what I'm saying to you is today's context where there have been legal abolitions, like in 1807 in England, in 1867 in America, and so on. And the majority of the world, I think almost all the world now, has agreed that slavery should be outlawed. In that context is a different context to the medieval context, which already had slaves everywhere.
Okay.
And there will be two rulings. That context has a ruling, and this context has a ruling. Yeah.
Okay.
Also, for example, you know gun laws in America. Yeah. Why don't they abolish the buying?
I don't know. They defend themselves. They think they should have the right to bear arms.
No,
But that's
because
another issue.
No. It relates perfectly actually. You know why? Because the thing is, if you look at gun laws, how many people get killed in America
A lot.
by these mass shooters? Yeah. So why do they not abolish is it the Second Amendment? What is it? Yeah. Why don't they abolish it?
There are various reasons for
Because
it.
you know why there will be riots. People are not going to give up their guns. So at the time of the Prophet ﷺ slavery, it wasn't something that was introduced like you're going to get rid of it like that.
Yeah,
That's
I
why the
explained this to him.
complaint.
Yeah.
So exactly. Do you not see the correlation where in today's time, where we're living today, where they can see mass people in slavery, at least people were the Prophet ﷺ would treat them right, they clothe them how he clothed them. Yeah. Here people are dying at the hands of people who own guns. Yeah, not all of them, but they do not abolish it. Why? Because people will start causing riots.
Okay, but
You know what I'm
you
saying?
know.
Do you not see? It's
Well,
not
the
that
thing is,
easy.
there are other times when people said like, oh, there needs to be a gradual introduction of a law like alcohol, for example. And yes, I don't see in the Quran things saying like slavery is from the devil, like they say about alcohol and gambling.
you're right.
So
You're right.
there isn't that sort of there isn't a trajectory kind of clearly condemning it that I see in the Quran.
Yes,
And
that's a valid point. I'll tell you why that's a valid point. Now let me explain. No, you're definitely saying something correct there. In essence, here's what we say, right? In essence, the interaction between person and person, okay, that can take different forms. Now, the thing is, the interaction I have with you right now, we're equals. Hopefully, according to the law and stuff like that. Obviously, I have a very,
to our society.
I have advantages. I'm joking. I'm sure you have, advantages as well. Now, the point I'm saying is that it's an equal relationship. Relationships in and of themselves, if they're based on, let's say for example, the Quran says, let me be completely honest about this, وَجَعَلْنَا بَعْضَهُمْ فَوْقَ بَعْضٍ دَرَجَاتٍ لِيَتَّخِذَ بَعْضَهُمْ بَعْضًا سِخْرِيًّا or سُخْرِيًّا. There's two verses, there's two qira'as. That we have allowed some people to be placed above and beyond other people, so that those individuals can take them as sukhriya, which means like, in other words, they can use them. Now, the idea is that is an allowance, a Quranic allowance. In the slavery or the relationship between slave owner and slave let's say, or the indentured servant and the master is as exploitative, arguably as exploitative as a relationship between an employee and an employer, depending on how that is framed. No, it can't be.
I know.
It can't be
At the point it is, you can call slavery, but like
Yeah,
an
yeah.
employee in this society isn't a slave.
No, it depends on the context. For example, if you have someone working for a transnational corporation, yeah, like they do, China, or let's say Bangladesh, yeah,
Wage
or like
slaves.
Primark.
Okay,
Primark has a thing in Primark, right?
Alright, I won't kind of speak about like kind of exploitative working conditions. Yeah, those are bad as well. Maybe you could call some of those factories slavery, okay? But you know, in the UK, like to say like, oh no, you work for Coca-Cola or you work for
Not in the UK.
Starbucks, you're a slave.
I haven't made the thing about
Okay.
Starbucks being a slave.
Okay,
I'm
but
talking about-
some people might think
I'm
you were
sa-
talking about that.
No. So what I'm saying is that since the idea of an exploitative relationship ranges, yeah, the idea of that relationship itself depends on the interactions and the parameters. So if the interactions are inherently exploitative, then that is a bad relationship. That is a haram relationship. That's a wrong relationship. But in and of itself, the existence of a superior or an inferior or someone higher and lower, the Quranic discourse doesn't say that that as a concept is a wrong thing. Because I have more money than you. Because if you take that thought to its logical extreme, you do have Marxism. Do you know what I'm trying to say? Because if one says that the reason why slavery is wrong is because of the hierarchy between two people, right? Then if that is the ultimate reason why it's wrong,
I wouldn't make that argument.
right? But if because there's a power dynamic between the two and there's a hierarchy, there's a higher and a lower. If that's the reason why it's wrong, we are saying it's wrong because of other reasons, yes? Because of the interactions.
Yes,
If
because
that's the reason,
like slavery in general is wrong because
Because
you
of the
own a
interaction,
person.
exploitation.
That person doesn't have freedom. That person doesn't have the right to
Well, that's a
decide.
No, but that's
Okay.
different. Slavery.
freedom. Why
Yeah, well,
they
No,
get
but what's
free?
the
Well, because
definition of slavery,
the slave
Because
the
you can't
slavery in
compare, the term is the same, but it's not the same thing.
no,
You get it?
the kind of slavery practice.
What comes to your mind
was
when
it-
you
well,
say
I mean, are you gonna? So are we gonna talk about slavery in Islamic history or slavery according to what Muhammad did? Sometimes you want to just what Muhammad did. Sometimes you talk to kind of like the rulings of medieval jurists. So within medieval Islamic history,
They refer back to. They're just trying to find out what Muhammad did.
You can hold this if you can hold it.
it's not in itself like
That-
at most it's like a proxy though. It's not in itself kind of. I think if the central issue is what Muhammad did and what he said was okay, his teachings and so on, then like then at that time, yeah. So at that time, like you would be someone who could be ordered to do labor. If you're a slave belonging to someone, they could order you to do labor. And there's evidence of Muhammad doing that. He like told one of his slaves to carry luggage, for example. And also within Muhammad's time, you could buy and sell people, so they were your property. Okay, and so and that is like a violation of freedoms. And so I don't think we would call that merely like an employee
Okay, perfect.
relationship.
No, I agree. Now, that what you've done there, I've listened to what you're saying, and what you're employing really is a liberal framework. So, in other words, for you, the best thing that you can have is freedom.
No,
And
no, no,
and
that's
it's those
not
freedom-
that's
yeah,
not it.
Right. So, if freedom
Freedom is
transgressed-
one good thing.
no problem. But how can you prove that?
Oh, we really
No,
need
no,
to go there. There's
no,
some,
no,
there's
we
some,
really
there's,
do, because that's
okay,
your-
but
that's
that's
your
a really
presupposition.
no, but before
Yeah.
okay, well, like before we go to like
There's two-
why are things
Can I
good?
explain something? Sorry, one thing. There's a liberal thing called Nozick. I'm not sure if you've heard of it.
No, I haven't.
Nozick talks about freedom, okay? And the discussion of freedom is actually a deep intellectual academic one. My postulation today to you is that freedom as a concept has been abused, right? And it's not used in the correct way. Some, in my opinion, freedom that you're talking about doesn't actually even exist.
You don't know exactly what freedom is.
Okay, so what can you say?
So I'd say
What
like as human rights, for example, would be a good example of like the human rights documents or that sort of thing.
Ngram and you write the words, Google Ngram is a really interesting tool, by the way. Yeah, so it shows you what the keywords in books are in different time periods from the 1800s, yeah? So if you write down, and I urge people that are watching this as well to do the same thing, write down the phrase human rights on Google Ngram, you'll find that there's a spike in 1948 from when that term was used. Now, human rights as a concept, therefore, with all 30 articles as written in the convention, this is quite new, okay? Now, it would seem to be an egregious anachronism to use such a post-World War II kind of document to try and refer to medieval practices. I think that would be
but
problematic.
sometimes it seems like
Now,
you say that
unless-
you should go back. We should go back to. Sometimes it seems
Yeah,
like you say
yeah.
that we should go back to these medieval practices, and then
Yeah.
sometimes you say like, kind of, oh, now in this day and age, slavery shouldn't be legal. But when you say that, you're actually benefiting from the achievements that kind of liberal, humanist, and secularist thinkers and societies
I think
have
you're wrong
achieved
about that.
by
I think, no. Yeah,
coercing
I
Muslim
think-
countries to stop
I think
slavery
you're
and to make slavery be
That's
abolished
absolutely-
worldwide.
What you said there is quite frankly ahistorical, because if you look at, for example, John Locke, John Locke, who talked against slavery in his books, The True Treatise of Government, the liberal, he's the founding father of liberalism, was in fact someone who was a colonial. He justified colonialism, and in fact,
The thing is, like, we aren't obliged to kind of defend any single person's entire corpus because we don't follow a cult of personality, and we aren't obliged to kind of, according to any sort of religious beliefs, to try and justify any single person.
No problem.
We can
No
think we
problem.
can say as a thinker has good ideas, and then say, and these are his
but
bad
what
ideas.
you said was that liberal people coerce Muslims to free slaves. What I'm telling you is
Maybe they shouldn't be called liberals. Let's just call them the West.
Let me correct you.
Let's call them the West.
No,
if
let
we
me
don't want to
correct
call
you.
them liberals.
Liberalism itself allowed slavery in abstraction, in conception, and in practice. And liberal governments from when America was established in 1776 all the way up until this time have practiced slavery in the most racist way possible. So I don't know how you can say that now they forced us to say that they freed the slaves. It didn't work like
fair
that.
enough. Let's call it secular humanists.
So
then.
what
you have benefited from the work of secular humanists.
We haven't benefited from anyone.
You
In
have,
fact, we've been the receiving end.
No, because
We've been the colonized.
Muslim countries wouldn't
Yeah,
have
We've been the
abolished
colonized.
slavery until kind of the
but you're
until
confusing.
kind of Western powers started kind of pressuring and persuading other countries to abolish slavery.
But
And
those
that's why
Western
Muslim
powers,
countries were so slow to do it.
Those Western powers themselves justified slavery for hundreds.
Earlier in the time, yeah.
No, not only earlier in the time, they're continuing to justify it.
How
And
can you justify it when you've abolished it legally?
well, they continue to justify it. Well, even after the abolition in 1807 in this country and 1867 in America, do you think that the whole discussion was muted? Do you think that the whole discussion was muted?
So, are you saying that
No, what I'm
because
saying
there
is
are American citizens who thought that slavery was a
sorry.
good thing?
You've used key terms and you've unjustifiably used them. You've used terms like liberal, secular, humanist. Now, I don't know why. Let's define those terms. Liberalism, okay? There's nothing inherent within liberalism which disallows slavery outright if a social contract would allow it, and or if there's an economic benefit to a particular nation, as was the case, as was justified by the Americas, and by those proponents of slavery within using the framework of liberalism.
There isn't like a book or a figure within liberalism who you can say this is the canon. Okay, so there'll be a range of opinions within liberalism.
Accepted, but what I'm saying to you is
so-
it's conceivable using liberal thought. My argument is as follows: it is as conceivable, and I want to try and disprove this. It is as conceivable within liberalism, within humanism, and within secularism to justify slavery of the kind that you are against. It as conceivable as through an Islamic system. The only difference is, and I'll explain to you how I can prove this. The only difference is with the Islamic system, there was an inbuilt mechanism that made it as an objective of the Sharia to do away with slavery as an institution. There is no inbuilt mechanism within liberalism which persuades political leaders to do the same thing. And if there was, then my question is, historically, how comes we didn't see that? How comes the founding fathers of America all owned slaves. Do you think that they were illiterate in the field and understanding of liberalism? George Washington had slaves. You see, I mean, was he an illiterate person? Did he not know? He was the one who was taking in the liberal ideas. So not only were liberal philosophical thinkers justifying colonialism, which is a kind of slavery, by the way, because colonialism is like slavery. To be honest, yes. They were justifying it. They were giving their governments the go ahead, the philosophical go ahead. But then you had those political leaders who would act upon that, and the populace, the masses, the liberal, secular, humanist masses that would act upon that. So I think it's a little bit unfair. I think you must admit it's unfair to say, well, after all this reform that the white man has done, which in fact wasn't reform but was exploitation for 400, 500 years, now and we forced you Muslims to free your slaves. No, it wasn't like that. What happened was that you put us into slavery, you colonized us, and then after that you realized for economic reasons that slavery was not something which was tenable, maintainable, or sustainable in the economic system, and that's why in America there was a war, because the South was benefiting more than the Northeast in terms of economic slavery, and because the Industrial Revolution was taking a turn and certain economic things were happening. So the reason why abolition of slavery took place was not because the white man realized that slavery was incompatible with humanism, secularism, or liberalism, was because the white man couldn't afford slavery anymore. That was the reason why slavery ended. Nothing to do with liberalism, my friend. Trust me, they used liberalism as a way to colonize people, as a justification for it. John Locke, J.S. Mill, all of those people were in charge of advising governments how to deal with the colonized, how to deal with the black man. David Hume was a racist.
Okay,
You know,
can we deal with some of the claims you've made so far? Because if you make like 30 claims, I might forget some of the earlier ones.
But do you retract that statement that, okay, because this trajectory, sorry to say, but this white man's history, that we must be the white savior that saved you Muslims from enslaving those individuals, and enslaved you, developing people and brown people, from annihilating yourselves and destroying and exploiting the world, when in fact we know that the white man was responsible to a large extent, not all white people of course, but the Western elite was responsible for this institution, and it was done in a way which, if only they had taken some of the Islamic principles.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, okay, so first of all, you're defining kind of liberalism, or you're using the term in a very particular way, kind of really quite an anachronistic way, because people who are liberals today aren't going to like follow every word that John Locke wrote or every word that the founding fathers wrote.
Yes, I agree.
We aren't in a kind of cult of personality whereby kind of, because one person is considered like authoritative, we have to defend their entire corpus. Okay, so we follow the good ideas that they had, and where those ideas were even hypocritical to their actions, the good ideas will stand by themselves. Okay, so good ideas with respect to kind of human rights and with respect to abolitionists and respect to humanist values, those are what are followed by liberals today. Okay, and as for the as for like whether I should take back this idea that kind of the Western world kind of encouraged Skin color is, irrelevant in this discussion.
No, it's not irrelevant.
It is irrelevant.
No, it's not
because
relevant when you have
like,
400
no,
years
the
of
fact,
black
no,
slavery.
No, it's
Of
irrelevant
course
in this
it's irrelevant.
discussion. No, it is. It
No,
is.
it's not
Because
irrelevant.
it's about the
It
ideas.
was
it's
all about skin colour
No,
when it came to
when
slavery.
when
Of
I
course it's
said
relevant
when
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 it's
I
slavery.
no when I
How
said
can we
that
have this
Western
that?
countries.
James.
When I no listen
Don't say
listen
it's
to the whole point.
irrelevant.
Listen to the whole point.
Don't say it's
When I said that Western countries persuaded Muslim countries to finally abolish slavery. That's what happened. They made an organization
1920s
to
did.
abolish slavery.
I think
okay,
James-
don't interrupt me, man. And
No,
so,
but
and so
when they're
finally-
making
and
them
so
states.
the-
When
no,
they're
but
making
no,
them
the
states.
point is that
Go ahead.
even if those Western countries were black, or even if those Western countries were purple, it would be the same difference. So there isn't that much point in mentioning
James,
white
sorry,
and black
no,
unless
no,
you want
it's-
to like arouse kind of like tribalistic mentality, or like
James, if you
try
don't
and
mind.
arouse the crowd, play the crowd, and
I'm
say,
not trying to play
oh,
the crowd.
oh, you
I'm
the
just
white
trying-
man, oh, you the
No.
this and that.
Okay,
So it's not.
do you
it's
mind
not
if I
relevant.
come back and answer you? Right?
Yeah, okay.
So you made a few good points, and I want to answer some of them, right? The first thing that you said was that we don't have to defend personalities like John Locke or Immanuel Kant or John Stuart Mill or Voltaire or Montesquieu or whoever you want. Yeah. And I agree with you that you're not obliged as a liberal to do that. However, what you have to understand is that within liberalism, there are principles. And those principles tell us what's possible, what's probable, what's conceivable. Now, what I mean by that is that in contractarian liberalism, the idea of a social contract is central. Okay, so the idea that was first promoted by Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan, the idea that you have a mass population that cede legitimacy to a sovereign master who then can universalize a law. Now, this is a principle of liberalism. In fact, you could go as far as to argue that without this social contract, liberalism would not exist.
Okay.
No, I've let you speak for some time. So let me tell you why. The reason why is because, of course, if you don't have a government with legitimacy and a mandate, from a liberal perspective, then it could easily fall into anarchy, right? So it will change ideology, because anarchy is a distinctive ideology to liberalism. So from that perspective, I'm not quoting John Stuart Mill, or say, for instance, John Locke, who was the founding father of liberalism, to show you, look how bad his ideas were, and therefore look what you're trying to defend. No, I'm showing you his principles, which were agreed upon by almost every other contractarian liberal that came after him. So if you consider yourself a liberal and you're espousing human rights values, which of course are an extension of the liberal project, then you have to be held to them. Then you have to accept that there are principles which allow for your ideology to churn out certain net results. So for instance, the case of, I've made this case before about apostasy, yes? When I said that John Locke said that when you can kill an apostate, yes? You can kill a Christian country, or a Jewish country, for example, you can kill an apostate because the country is known in that way, and it's not seen as an illiberal thing to do, to kill an apostate from that perspective. I'm not saying that that's John Locke's view, and therefore all liberals think that. I'm saying that John Locke reckoned principally, based on the abstract principles of liberalism, and in particular social contract theory, which almost, like I said, all the contractarians believe in, that such a death penalty for apostasy is conceivable through liberalism. And I'm saying the same thing. I'm saying slavery, colonialism, and all of those things, it should not be assumed, because here's the narrative that has to be shut down straight away. The narrative is you have human rights, and you mentioned the human rights document, human rights like the freedom of religion, the freedom of expression, freedom of speech. Let me tell you something very important. This is very important, James, and I want you to remember it for the rest of your life. Honestly, I want you to
probably will.
Okay, listen to me very carefully, right? This is a Western, yes? It's romanticization. I'll tell you why. When you say you have freedom of expression, or when the West says to us you have freedom of religion, or whatever it may be, speech, yeah? In what context is it the case? I will tell you the liberally conceivable concept. The extent to which we have freedom of religion, expression, faith, or speech, is the extent to which the liberal government, through social contract, determines what is the acceptable freedom of expression, what is the acceptable freedom of speech, or what is the acceptable freedom of religion. That is why it was conceivable for the greatest liberal minds to say atheists shouldn't be in our society, like John Locke said. The reason why he said that was more to do with his own personal views than to do, and exploitation and so on. It's not against liberalism. Therefore, if you're coming to say to me, look, here's the trajectory. You know, these Muslim countries have been forced. The reason why Muslim countries in the 1900s may have been forced to do anything is because in 1904, a few Western countries owned 85% of the world. They were the slaves themselves. Of course, so this is the irony of all ironies. You're saying that the Western countries forced Muslims to free slaves. They had them as slaves. This is the most ridiculous.
Not at the same time, though.
Yes, at this time. You said 1920. I'm saying that there were there was colonized people at that time. There were slaves at that time, and even though it was legally stopped in 1867 in America, it continued and continues to this day. That's why there is a Anti-Slavery Act 2010, and every year they produce a report talking about how many people are human trafficked.
Yeah.
This is in this country, so slavery hasn't ended. What I'm saying is that from an Islamic perspective, you said that the impetus to free slaves from an Islamic perspective was a liberal, humanist, secular, Western one. I'm saying no, the impetus was not a humanist, liberal, secular one. It was originally a Quranic one. What's the evidence? Chapter 90 of the Quran says, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةُ فَكُّ رَقَبَةٍ. It says, what is the good way?
Okay.
Listen, it says, what is the good way? Freeing slaves is the good way. So you can't tell me that now the white man told us what morality is, and they're the ones who told us that, you know, freeing slaves was a bad thing. We had inbuilt within our system a whole method, a maqsad, objective of freeing slaves. But it did so in a way which would be economically conducive to those people at that time, and would not collapse the international or national economies like what happened in America, the American Civil War. And it was a failed experiment, and slavery continues to this day. So what I'm trying to put to you today, and to end off, of course, James, is that this idea that, now sorry to say, but race doesn't matter or color doesn't matter, I think is also a false one, because the reason why I objected to that is because the slavery that existed, which was specific to the West, was a racist slavery. When the white man, okay, and I'm going to say that you can underline it with 100 letters. When the white man decided to go to Western Africa and take those guys in Western Africa and put them in their cotton fields in Southern America, part of the reason of justification for that is because they thought their white skin was in fact made them more superior to this black guy. Otherwise, why didn't they go to somewhere else in the world? Why did they go to West Africa in particular? It wasn't just a convenient trade route. It's because they found opportunity and justification through racism. So you can't say race doesn't matter there, man. Race, of course, look at the Empire records. They were mentioning race themselves. Like, where are the white, this and that, and biblical justifications, talking about Genesis chapter 20, when they talk about Noah's son, all that stuff. I can find you all of that stuff. So race matters is part of the discourse. I think it's disingenuous to say it does, James.
Okay. So again, that's like, I think you maybe made like at least 4 points, so I might kind of forget to address one because we've been talking for a while. So if that's the case, then hopefully SD Dawa will allow me to actually publish a comment below the video, because normally I'm back.
Let him finish, because he's going to say that he didn't.
Yeah, because
You can say what you want. So what?
Okay.
And what?
All right, we've still
Okay,
got,
well,
we've
whatever.
got someone.
So if I forget to
Hijab. Let him finish
let
before.
him finish, 'cause so
We
it
don't want no
doesn't seem
tears. We don't want no
disingenuous.
tears.
yeah, so
But does what I say make sense to you?
well, no, not really. There are lots
You
of.
never got it.
I was just, you know, that
Come
was a
on,
mistake.
I
It was
think
a
we can be
mistake.
fair. We can be fair with each other now. I think there's a lot of.
No,
is
let me
there a lot of truth in
no,
what I said?
no,
Is
come on.
there-
Let me actually make my
Go on,
rebuttal.
go on.
Don't just like kind of try and
Doesn't have
smooth
to
it
be a rebuttal.
over.
We can agree.
Yeah, but it's a rebuttal because you've said several things that are unreasonable and wrong, and that needs to
Okay,
be corrected.
go ahead.
And so what I was just going to say is that, like, you know, I might have forgotten one of the things that you said just now, because you did make 5 or 6 points over that time. So I'll try and address them all. And if I do forget one, then I'll leave a comment underneath SD Dawa, as long as they don't block my comments, which they normally do. Okay. Anything that refutes you is a load of rubbish.
James.
Yeah, anything that refutes you.
You said in a comment, you said that, you said, read a book, you idiot. You did that, yes or no?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, why? Why
Because
you
he
said
probably
that?
probably said something stupid.
Yeah,
That's
no,
not
he didn't
blocking
say
though,
that.
is it? That's not
He
blocking.
didn't say that.
Okay, first of all, like, so we need to talk, so liberalism, yeah? Okay, so liberalism did start in the 1800s, and those were the,
It didn't. It started in the
okay, whatever. Like, you know, classical liberalism, yeah? yeah,
Yeah.
that's often kind of, sometimes it gets called as, it's often
Not
like
die 1706.
seen as in a kind of laissez-faire way. It often gets aligned with right-wing economics and like it
Yeah.
means freedom, but normally for freedom for people who like own things, like own this capital power.
Yeah.
Okay, and so the trajectory
Yes.
as it kind of goes towards modern day,
Yes.
like you still see kind of neoliberals who kind of like focus on the capitalist aspects and would agree with like the founding fathers, and some of them might even like still agree with slavery and that sort of thing. But kind of like when people talk about liberals nowadays, they often mean like this kind of left-wing group of people who
Yeah, we're not
kind of
talking about
focus on kind of compassion, empathy, tolerance, and these other values. Okay, and so the way that was born out from this kind of like classic liberal is because kind of there was this idea of like the individual being supreme, and that if we're all equal as individuals, then what would be the most benevolent way for us to interact, and those sorts of considerations. Okay, and so if anything, I would advocate for that. And if and you said like you're talking about like what is likely or what is possible or under this kind of under liberalism, and you're still at that point talking about this kind of capitalist almost version of liberalism, this kind of like a very classic John Locke style version of liberalism. And you
I would
talked
say
about
capitalism more Adam Smith. I mean, the invisible hand of the economy.
Well, okay, he's there,
Supply side
he's there, but
Go ahead,
other
go ahead.
other liberal speakers kind of lend themselves to that to some degree.
Go ahead.
And so when you talk about the social contract and like kind of the social contract is an idea for justifying why the state has authority to make laws. Okay,
Yes.
but so saying that the state kind of has authority to make a law, providing a theory for why the state has an authority to make a law, isn't the same as saying any law made by a state is a good law. Okay, and so there are different within like this body of ideas that might be called liberal, in particular ones that emphasize empathy and universal rights of human beings. You could say like those people wouldn't have to say, oh, due to social contract theory, you can't say anything against that apostasy law because the state has the authority by the social contract. No, that's not true. You can say that the law is a bad law, but still say that this state can make a law. Okay, it has the power to do that, so it has the authority to do that. But you can still criticize the law and say it's a bad law, and so slavery would be a bad law, and apostasy, like killing people just for changing their religion and saying I don't believe in this religion anymore, that is a bad law. That's kind of the punishment doesn't meet the crime. It's sick and it's just barbaric and awful. Okay, and then now this is where I kind of might forget like exactly all the points you made before. What did you say after that? Can you remember any of the other things you said after that?
I can't remember.
You don't want to help me about that.
No,
Okay. I'll continue. I'll try my best to remember as well. Anyway.
I talked
But
about the racial part of it.
Okay, there was something a little. Can you remember what was one before the racial part?
We talked about race. I can't remember, man. And the
Okay.
chronology. I talked about the fact that principles. You've covered this, right? So in principle, it's possible. It's continuous.
Oh yeah. Okay, great. And so so let's talk about So you raised. Is it possible for a liberal society to kind of end up introducing an apostasy law? And so what I would say is we need to compare how likely it is for a Western society today to start introducing laws like apostasy or like slavery again, and then say, are they more or less likely to do that than a society that takes its principles and its guidance directly from Mohammed's example and his teachings? And so if you weighed that up, which is more likely to do so, I think you'd definitely find that it is the Islamic society that takes its guidance from there that would be more likely to reintroduce apostasy and would be more likely to reintroduce slavery.
I get what you're saying,
because
but I think
there
you've
are
misunderstood the argument.
because there are like
I get what you're saying,
there are
but I think-
scholars like Salih Fawzan, who's one of the senior kind of scholars, one of the senior scholars of Saudi Arabia, and principal of rather like professor of Islamic sciences at in Medina. And he says that slavery is part of Islam and will always be a part of Islam, and you can buy his book of Islamic jurisprudence, and he will say the same thing in there. And so
No, but I think they asked him. That was one of the people on my survey, actually. Salih Fawzan.
unless he's changed his
No, no,
opinion,
no,
unless he's changed his
No,
opinion.
no. I'll tell you what. I'll come back to that because But what I will say to you before, can I just say?
Well, there's one other thing. There's one other thing. So about that, about like kind of the race of whether it's relevant to this discussion. Like it depends what we're trying to achieve in this discussion. Like if we're trying to like think about what would be best for the future, then I don't think it is relevant to this discussion.
Okay,
I think if we're talking about what's best for society in the future, then I don't think it is relevant to say to like kind of pour it over and say like kind of like racial issues. I mean, obviously like kind of we need to safeguard against racism, but like you can do that without saying, oh, you saying that as a white man, that's pretty rich, or attitudes like that. It had that kind of tone earlier on.
If I meant like that, I apologize.
Okay, and so and
You're right, you're correct.
and the let's see what else.
Is there anything else?
No, like so I know I think we just need to, I do want to conclude with like if you're going to take which is going to be the more firm and sound kind of set of principles instead of guidelines and norms and legal system to build a just society in the future and a fair society in the future. Is it going to be kind of the current norms in Western society today and documents like the United Nations human rights documents? Is that going to be the better basis, or is kind of Islamic scripture going to be the better basis? I think it's very easy to show that the
Islamic culture.
Islamic culture is inferior to producing equitable, fair, free, tolerant society that doesn't allow slavery and doesn't allow people
Economic
to be
slavery,
murdered just for changing their
James,
religion.
can I come back to a few points, because I think what you've done there, you've done a really good job in trying your best. Okay, and honestly, I have to give you credit. Because
you also mentioned kind of like the narrative of whether it was kind of the Western countries who coerced and pressured and advised Muslim countries to actually abolish slavery, and you said, oh no, that's rubbish. And I think kind of like history will
I didn't say that was
prove that wrong.
No, I said that the time you're talking about was ironically a time where Western countries had been colonizing the Muslim countries. That's what I said.
Here's the thing though.
Here's
Here's the thing though. Like kind of, you can say that the Western countries in like 1850, they did all these bad things. So who are they to say to Muslim countries to do bad things? But we can still take the good things that they did, which Muslim countries were slow to do. And so you still need to, if you're going to make the case that it is an Islamic doctrine to end slavery because of this verse in kind of the Quran that says that kind of some of the zakat money should go towards freeing slaves, then you need to try and account for why it is that Muslim countries ended up being so much slower than Western countries to do so.
I haven't allowed you to speak, so I think I should. I have to say, you tried your best. And you tried your best, and you have made some points. Although some of it, you've made some equivocations. I have to point them out. First equivocation that you made, you used the word good and bad. Now, good and bad on a liberal basis depends on what's legitimate and illegitimate. What's acceptable, what's non-acceptable. What's mandated and what's not mandated. So if I say it's acceptable, it's mandated and legitimate on political liberalism that you can have slaves, for instance, and I can make that argument using the social contract. If I say it's legitimate, it's acceptable and so on liberalism, on political liberalism, to have colonies, right? Just like John Stuart Mill would agree with me, just like John Locke would agree with me, just like Immanuel Kant would agree with me, just like Montesquieu would agree with me, just like the American founding fathers would agree with me, the writers of the Federalist Papers would agree with me, and so on and so forth. Then it's a different case to make, because when you say good and bad, now good and bad is defined by liberalism if you're a liberal. Now you have different kinds of liberalism. So you have political liberalism. Now what's desirable on political liberalism might be differentiated, by the way, by what is desirable on social liberalism, okay? And I'll give you an example of that. Now, utilitarian-based liberalism, the type of which that John Stuart Mill defended and wrote a book called on utilitarianism, and chapter 4 talked about how to prove utilitarianism, and then he talked about that which is desirable, which makes you happy, is that which is good. That's what he said. So if you talk about social liberalism, having a slave on social liberalism could only be objected to be acceptable both on political liberalism and on social liberalism. So I think the idea here, because there's two things we're doing. We have to look at the principles, and then we have to look at the history. Okay? Now, the history might not always be in line with the principles, and vice versa. It could be the case that in abstraction, in philosophical abstraction, that the principles allow these things to happen, but that in historical reality, those things did not happen, and vice versa. Now, what I'm saying to you, I'm putting to you, is that there is nothing, for example, in liberalism which abolishes or does anything to do with racism. There were many liberals racists, and there's nothing within liberalism, social liberalism, political liberalism, or any kind of economic liberalism, or political liberalism, which says, for example, racism is wrong. So if someone wants to predicate an exploitational economic relationship on a racial system, on liberalism, then that could be justified philosophically in abstraction. There's nothing, and that's why you find up until Winston Churchill, you have racist people in this country and other countries in the West. Why? Because there's nothing within their world view which stops racism. They were forced to be multicultural when they begged, the second world countries that they once colonized, subjects from those countries, to come back into the country so that they can build their infrastructure. And they knew that they had to get along with them in order to make societies work. That's why racism was seen as bad. It's nothing to do with liberalism. It's nothing to do with human rights. Because human rights is an extension of liberalism. And in fact, I can't even recall in the human rights document that which explicitly condemns, this kind of attitude, inherent attitude within a human being. So the point I'm making to you is this: is if I said slavery is a good thing, as a liberal, you couldn't even refute that statement. If I believe that to be the case, you can't say that's good and that's bad. Because good and bad is something which is determined by the mechanisms that different liberal philosophers put down. And you can't prove philosophically that that is bad according to liberal. Colonization is bad, slavery, exploitation relation. In fact, you could argue that the kind of supply side economics that you once referred to, that was found by people like Adam Smith, and that was objected to by people like John Keynes, Maynard Keynes, who of course had a different model, and so on. That kind of liberalism actually facilitates the exploitational relationships, which you could argue compound what, I'm not going to use this term, but this relationship with surplus value. Marx calls it surplus value, right? So the idea of the worker and all that kind of stuff. Exploitation happens in capitalism. So you could even make an economic case against liberalism and say, look, this is what's happening now with the IMF bank, which is legitimate from an economic liberal perspective, where they're giving the African subcontinental countries these big loans that they can't pay back, and that's effectively putting half the population into slavery. And now they have to do this and that and the other in order to pay them back. It might not be direct slavery, but it's an economically sanctioned slavery of exploitation, capitalistic exploitation, which is legitimate on economic liberalism, sanctioned by political liberalism, and not contradicted by social liberalism. Therefore, we have to be honest. What we're saying is that I think you have this trajectory of, the white saviorism complex, that the white man came with his Western ideas to help us brown people understand what true morality was and what isn't. It's actually a false notion on liberalism, because there's nothing inherent, nothing which inheres within that philosophy which objects to racism, which objects to exploitation, which objects to colonialism, and so on. So I think that the argument is a flawed one. It's a good attempt to refute me, but it wasn't a philosophically satiating one. Excellent attempt. Yeah, it was a good fight. It was a nice try. What I will say to you is that in Islam, I'll repeat this, we're not apologists to the liberal world, because I said to you, I'm quoting scholars from the medieval world before. Like Al-Ghazali, who I quoted, died 1111. Yes, he died 1111. He wrote a book called Al-Mustasfa, talking about the usul and this and that and the objects of Sharia. He himself said in parts of his works that slavery, the objective of it is to do away with it. Yes, he said this. This is not a response to the liberal that's forcing us to say this. No, we said this before John Locke even lived. This was 500 or 600 years before John Locke. So the point is, the systems were in place we have a justifiable moral reason to say that freeing slaves is a good thing, and that's what the Quran says. وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةُ فَكُّ رَقَبَةٍ. What is the good way? Freeing slaves. That's the Quran. You don't have any alternative liberal reason to say that slavery is wrong. If there is one, or exploitation is wrong, or colonialism is wrong, or that freeing the slave is a good thing, I would like to hear it.
Okay, yeah, of course.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would like to hear it.
And so, like, the two main points you made, or like, just to summarize the points that I've noted down. You talked about racism in Islam versus liberalism. You talked about slavery in Islam versus liberalism, and you said that and you also mentioned Al-Ghazali at the very end.
No, I talked about something which you missed out, which is very important, which is actually the crux of my argument.
Okay.
I said that you were saying you were using the words good and bad. Yes.
Okay.
This is a good law, apostasy is a good law, this is a bad law, or whatever. I'm saying good and bad is that which is conceivable and acceptable and legitimate within liberalism.
Okay.
You have to address this point. How can you say that you, as a liberal, you believe that killing the apostate is wrong when actually philosophical, political, social, and economic liberalism does not object to it from a principle perspective? I'm not John Locke just because he said it was wrong. I'm using him as a supplementary evidence. My question is, from a structurally philosophical perspective, how can you prove that killing the apostate in a state which claims to be, say, for example, Christian or Jewish, is wrong on liberalism?
Okay, great. So the thing is, your conception of liberalism is anachronistic because you're only looking at the kind of 200-year-old liberal thinkers, and then you've constructed this idea of liberalism that hasn't advanced whatsoever. Okay, and so yes, it's true that back in those times there were people who, at the same time, were like espousing ideas of like kind of the sanctity of the individual and like being individualist, but then also were being contradictory in terms of slavery and racism and so on and so forth. Okay, but we're not beholden to those people. Okay, and so if you look
I agree with that.
Yeah, and so your concept of like you're a liberal, so why don't you think like these people 200 years ago is invalid?
Sorry,
it is invalid
that's
because
a straw man argument.
I
said
it isn't because
the structures, the principles.
you've taken this
structures of
conception.
social contract.
No, because you've taken this conception
But
of
James,
liberalism
but
that's
no,
not
that's not
applicable
my
to
argument.
today.
That's not my
because then
argument.
you talk about liberals today.
What is liberalism?
It depends.
Okay, is liberalism social contract? Can you have liberalism without social contract? Yes or no?
I don't know.
If you take away a social contract from liberalism, you have anarchy. Okay, it becomes a different ideology. I'm saying the existence of social contract allows for the universality of law to triumph over and above the individual's right to, let's say, for instance, freedom of expression.
No, but you can take this liberal
That's
idea.
my argument.
No, but you can take this individual idea of liberalism, of the the sacred individual, and that you shouldn't infringe on other people's freedom, and then extrapolate from that towards a kind of minarchist or anarchist society where
That's
people
not
are being.
liberalism then.
You've left what you
So you
kind
have
of
to reject
considered.
you have to reject your ideology.
Yeah, no, but the thing.
So you agree
okay,
with me then?
No, I don't agree with you because like
Yes.
because if what
Yes.
you're trying to do is debunk kind of 200-year-old people,
I'm
then
not
that's
doing that.
great. Because
I'm
you
not
aren't
doing that.
debunking anyone today. You aren't debunking kind
Yes,
of
I
people who like value
You don't understand the argument. I'm
infringing.
not doing that. I'm saying that all liberal contractarian, by definition, thinkers, they have to believe in a social contract.
No, but
So
yeah,
you
but
go
then
to
you're
us-
but then you're talking.
I'm saying
then
that
you're talking
in
about,
in
but those
principle,
people hardly exist today, though.
no, any liberal that lives now, whether they're constitutional,
Not really,
wherever
because
they-
you called them social liberals
It-
before. Could you define
No, no,
that?
no, no, no. I'm
Because
saying that
people
any
people
liberal-
who from this idea of the individual
No.
being having rights, which would be considered like in some respects a liberal idea. They have like from that kind of gained these ideas of kind of fairness and kind of what's the word not entropy, entropy, the word empathy. Yeah, they've gained empathy, like treating people the other way. And what you're saying doesn't whatsoever.
I'm
and
saying,
so, and so
you're
you,
not
like
understanding the argument.
you managed to
Can you have a
you managed
political
to kind of,
liberalism?
you managed to knock down like kind of
No, you
some
don't.
people in the 1800s who had like contradictory
1800s.
ideas and still managed to like
Forget about those people. I'm asking a simple question.
then
Is-
let's
one
forget
que-
about
I have,
them.
I have one question. Is it possible to have a political liberalism without a social contract?
I don't know. form of like of government was kind of this 7th century Medina
No, but
period.
That's an opinion.
That's a misrepresentation.
Yeah.
How is it?
No, let me explain to you. No.
Was your deen completed, and did you have the ideal society at that point?
No, it doesn't work like that. That's a very, I'll tell you what that is. That's a basic understanding of Islam.
So you see projection
so
there.
so where are you getting your Islam from there?
Okay, let me explain to you. Islam, okay, is governed by two things. You have the hukm, which is the law, yeah? And then you have the situation, the hal, and then you have tanzeel of the hukm, which means how that hukm takes, how it is implemented. That's how Islam is seen, yeah?
Yeah, but
It's not just seen as ahkam.
you're taking kind of like a machinery of jurisprudence that was invented 300 years afterwards. So where did the Quran, where did Rabbi Mohammed say,
Yes.
oh yeah, you like classify things according to exactly
living
these
law.
terms?
It's living law.
It's something that the scholars have constructed.
Let me explain.
So if you're going to,
James,
there
that's
are
a good
different
question.
things
Would
that you want to.
like me to
There are
answer?
there's enough things to be said though, because like there are different things that could be defended in Islam. You could either defend the scripture and what is recorded as the teachings that Muhammad is reported
James,
to
I
have
think
done,
you're the one who
or
needs
you
to defend
could,
your liberalism.
or you could try and defend like kind of
You can't
actual
even
fit.
prove why,
You
why
could try and defend
racism is
fit.
wrong on liberalism.
I could say you can't.
Can you prove it?
I could say the same thing.
Can
to
you?
I can do it. I can do it. I can do it with one hadith.
Yeah, and I could use
Yeah,
another
fadla.
hadith to disprove that. You're
Go on,
going
go on,
to
go on.
say.
No,
I'm going to
no,
say.
no, go on.
What you're going to
No, no,
say.
okay, go on.
What you're going to say.
I challenge you.
Yeah, what you
I say,
what
okay.
you
Oh, no
are going to
problem. I've got-
say
okay,
is that.
James, I've got this.
Yeah,
I've got
then
I'm
let me
happy.
say it.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
What you're about to say is that
Yes.
Muhammad is reported to have said that the Arab is not better than the Arab, and
the black man is not better than the white man. The
yeah,
white man is not better than
and
the black,
yet
yeah.
and yet there's another hadith where it
Says-
says that God gave eminence to one son of Hisham from all of humanity, and gave eminence to the Arabs or the Quraysh from them, and gave eminence to the and then gave eminence to the Hisham from the Quraysh, and based on that teaching, kind of the early Islamic scholars who kind of seem to be jumped.
No, you just refute
jumped.
now.
No, yeah, because you jumped between them as well. They they then derived from the teachings, kind of teachings like in their fiqh books that Arab women should not marry Muslim non-Arab men. So that's within the Islamic tradition as well. So there's racism within the Islamic tradition. There's racism within the
Let me
Western
correct you
tradition.
because you didn't reference anything there.
But do you know the one I'm talking about?
No, I know what you're talking about.
Okay,
but
so I
it's
didn't
not-
make it up though.
No, you did make it. Something's up. I'll tell you what you made up.
Okay,
No, I
something's
didn't.
made up.
You did make. You kind of because the thing is, when you present inexact evidences without references.
Okay, I don't remember it off by heart. I could bring it up. You want the
No,
exact?
no, it's okay. I can. No, then you require the references to be given to you, and you require the
It's
full.
easy. Just go into Sunnah, search eminence, and you'll be able to find
Okay.
several
What does the
different,
word
James, are you
several
gonna-
different routes.
I've never
That's
seen a
what-
hadith with
that's
this
what I
word
think.
eminence. You know. Us. That is. I don't know. I don't know.
James,
But actually, I'm thinking, what if it's wrong what the scholars came across? But that happens. That can be true.
Yeah, that's the thing. Is he's gone to a hadith and then he's gone to
If you're
someone's
going to say that
interpretation
Abdul
of that.
Wahab, he's a great scholar,
look at me,
and yet
James.
he
So you see,
rebelled
the
against,
thing that he was trying to say, an acrostic,
And
where
also
you
Abdul Wahab,
project like
What do you think about
new
it?
things.
Let's answer one time.
What do you think about that?
That's just like life support machine. That's how he survives in the park.
So the question of
He's not surviving at all.
the hadith quotation. Yeah, okay. I would like to know where in that hadith does it say a black man is better than a white man, or a white man is better than a black man, or an Arab is better than a non-Arab, or an Arab is better than an Arab.
It says
It doesn't contradict.
that
What's the idea of
God
them?
gave eminence to Arabs over non-Arabs.
No, it doesn't say that. No, the hadith doesn't mention Arabs, by the way.
And that's the reason. And that's the reason why. That's the reason why kind of Salafis today believe
James,
that kind of
read
in
the
the
hadith.
ideal Islamic state, that that precedence in leadership should go to Arabs over non-Arabs.
That's false.
Where
That's
there
false.
are
That's false. That's false.
when they're equal in piety.
No, no.
That's what Abu Khadija said. Would you refute Abu Khadija? Shamsi's
I'm
teacher.
not with the. Is that serious? Is that, are you serious?
I know that you aren't with Shamsi, but I said like you spend a lot of time. You spend a lot of time. Condemning like kind of 200 years ago.
You're bringing up people.
How much time do you spend like critiquing other Muslims today?
Please, Abu Khadija's next guy. Sorry to say, I don't know his background.
But no, it's irrelevant, bro. No, it's irrelevant to the argument.
He's been praised by other scholars.
It's not when
You know, I'm sure
why
he's very
should there be
knowledgeable.
rifts? There should be rifts between bad things. Like, for example, female gender. Like, how many Muslims here will refute the
Now he's gone into
the
FGM.
Shafi
What's
madhab
that?
because they say that female genital mutilation is obligatory. I mean, even if they do that, I don't see anything that's
Tell me what book you read for the Shafi'i madhab.
the Lives of the Traveller
By who?
by now
Noah something, yes.
yeah, no, but is that the Shafi madhab?
No, yes.
Yeah, and it contains the sound editions of the Shafi madhab.
No, yes, he does have the Mu'tamad. I'll give you that.
Okay,
no
okay.
No, I just wanted the reference. Now, what I was going to put to you now is that this hadith on Quraysh and Banu Hashim, and it's about Fatima, yes, and all of that stuff. Yeah, okay, no problem. Allah chose Bani Hashim, and He chose Quraysh, He chose Prophet Muhammad, who happened to be an Arab. That's not true. But the hadith does not say that your value as a human being is determined by your race. There is no hadith that says that. The only hadith we find is a hadith that says that there is no superiority over an Arab, over a non-Arab, or black man, white, and that is an authentic hadith. The Quran says.
They're both authentic
The
hadiths,
Quran,
by the way.
yes, they don't contradict each other.
No,
The
they're
Quran,
both very. I'm not using a weak hadith.
yes,
They're
the
both
Quran
they're
says,
both
"Inna
rated sahih.
akramakum 'inda Allahi atqakum." That the best of you that Allah has made you shu'uban wa qaba'il lita'arafu. Inna akramakum 'inda Allahi atqakum. Chapter number 49, verse number 24. Chapter 49, verse number 24. That Allah subhanahu خلقكم من ذكر وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. That we have made you into groups and tribes and so on, so that you may get to know one another. لتعارفوا. So the lamb here is called lamb ta'liliyya, which means the reason why Allah made human beings into different colors and different ethnicities is so that they may know one another. In other words, so that they can share experiences from different cultural and racial backgrounds. And then he says, listen to what the Quran says. You don't need to go to hadith. The Quran then says, Inna akramakum 'inda Allahi atqakum. That despite all of these racial differences, the best of you are those who have the most God consciousness. Okay? Now, having said that, this is very clear in our books. The question, of course, of you talked about the Arab having afdaliyya or having a position of leadership over non-Arab is one that has been mentioned in many books, but it's not in the way that you said it. It's mentioned by Al-Muwarridi, for example, in his book Ahkam Sultaniyya. It's mentioned by Al-Juwayni in his book Al-Ghiyathi. It's mentioned by Ibn Taymiyyah. And what do they say? They don't say Arab. They say Qurashi. Now, the idea that you have is that a Qurashi cannot be a black man. The Quraysh is a tribe, okay? And in that tribe, you have all races represented in that tribe. You have black people represented, people that look like me, people a little bit lighter than me, people darker than me, and so on. And some scholars said that the Khalif Aam has to be from this tribe. But that excludes Egyptians, it excludes Iraqis, it excludes Turks, it includes those individuals from other so-called Arab countries. So it's nothing to do with Arabs, it's to do with that particular tribe. If you're a Somali and you have a lineage back to Quraysh, which by the way many Somalis do have that lineage back, you can ask them, then they are more eligible to be leader than someone who is from Egypt, like me, an Arab. Now,
Okay, no, you said a bunch of things. Okay, no, you covered over something.
You couldn't answer his
When he was.
question, and you did it, Tommy Robinson here.
Yeah.
No. You couldn't answer his question about social construct, and he said, I don't know, and you pushed
No,
the nail.
but you know what he
you
did?
couldn't answer it.
There was
The
another
reason
question.
is
The
because
question
his conception of liberalism isn't relevant though.
No,
His conception of
the
liberalism
question,
is
James, no, the question,
actually an
Mark, can I ask you
anachronism.
my question?
Okay, no, but there's another thing about you when you were
there's
explaining
other things.
when you were explaining
Hijab.
They want to hear you
you
understand.
tried to explain the about God choosing one group from another group, and you mentioned you tried to explain the God choosing one group from another group. First, he chose one particular son of Hisham, Islam, and
So-
then
so-
and then he
so-
chose the Croatian, and
that's
so on and so
so
forth.
what?
Yeah,
What's that
and
got to do with,
so
wisdom?
like that choosing
How's that wisdom?
choosing
Yeah, choosing, yeah.
implies
Yeah.
you choose it because it's better than the other thing, and that's why it gets translated in English by
Yeah,
experts in
that's not
Arabic
true.
as
That's not true.
God
Okay.
gave eminence to them.
All right, I
okay?
get what you're
And so
saying.
you
Let me
didn't-
respond
you
to
didn't-
you.
didn't-
Let me respond to you.
And you didn't also
Let me
also
respond
respond
to
to
you. Let me respond
and
to
you-
it,
and
no
you-
problem.
no, but you didn't. You also didn't respond to the fact that
Yeah, yeah.
kind of within kind of the early Islamic scholars,
Yeah,
that they
okay,
took
yes,
the-
I didn't-
they
I
took
didn't-
this,
yes, no,
yes,
they didn't
and
take this, no,
they,
they
no,
didn't
they
take
took this and other things in order to say that
Yeah.
it is not acceptable for
No,
Arab
they
women
didn't say
to
it like
marry
that.
Arab men.
Let me explain
Did that
what they
happen
said.
or not?
No, not like that.
No, it did happen like
Can
that.
I explain? Because you haven't
I
read
mean-
the books in the primary source material.
what
You
would
had
the
to read them in
prophets
English.
from, like, the
Here's
West
what I will
nations?
tell you. Some people that Hanaf have said this in their books of fiqh, and of course Hanafis are we're watching this and they can bring out the books to tell to explain. What's mentioned in the madahib in that regard is that people of certain social levels, like for example, a woman who's used to luxury, yeah, and is used to certain socio-economic conditions, shouldn't marry someone, yeah, who is not used to that, because the argument went, if they go with that, then it might create problems in the relationship.
So are you saying none of them said that
No,
Arab women
no,
should not marry Arab
I'm
men?
coming to you. So in that vein, in that same light, they said that okay, but now what if you have people from one culture that would find it impossible to communicate with people from another culture, and so they started talking about languages and people from those places.
Then why did they make it specific to Arab
No,
women
they
and
didn't.
non-Arab
They
men?
didn't. They
They
did.
did.
No,
They
but
did.
I can give you the references.
Oh, you don't necessarily know exactly the
read?
references.
You know our source is better.
What's your source?
Well, I
hold
don't
on,
have
hold
it with
on.
me.
What's your source?
I'll bring it next week.
No.
What's your source? Here we go.
No.
Here we go, James.
What are you
Yeah,
doing?
we're gonna go
No,
again,
no.
James.
The thing is,
What?
you
How long do you want
you guys are, if you guys try and deny the fact that early
What's the
Islamic
source?
No, I've said
scholars
to you,
try
I
to
haven't denied
say
it, I've
that
said-
Arab women, like
James, what's the
Arab
source?
women, should
Name
not
them.
be allowed
Name
to
them. James, just tell us
to
the
marry
source.
Arab men.
Wait,
If you're going to try and deny that, so you're just going to end up with egg on your face.
So
You're
what about
going
the-
to end up with egg on your
The
face.
Prophet married a
I'll-
Jew.
What
now?
about it?
The Prophet married a
That's
Jew.
an Arab man marrying a non-Arab woman. I'm
Okay,
saying that
okay, no
Arab
problem.
women should not be allowed to marry
No,
non-Arab. That's something that
Bilal
is
ibn
something.
Rabah mentioned Hela bint whatever. She was an Arab. She was black. She was an Arab. What now?
Okay, so but that
that
doesn't
wrong?
change.
Is that
No,
wrong?
that
Is that
doesn't change the fact that some Arab
No, is that wrong or
scholars
right? Is that right or
reach.
wrong?
I'm not arguing for their opinions. Okay, I'm just stating. No, I'm stating. No. But the thing is, I'm stating that
We
this
take
is
the
what
prophet, not
Arab
the scholars.
scholars
So that's
have
fine.
said.
So
within-
here's the
No, but you're trying
question that he tried
you're
to
trying
do.
to whitewash the history there.
Give me
You're trying to
as
whitewash the
something.
history.
Give me
Scholars amongst them that also said the opposite. And these scholars are not the example, the Islamic example to listen. Ibn Hazm refutes the call of the Malikis about the black people being lowly. And also as well, you have to understand that the reference to black people is not referring to black Arabs. Most times it's referring to black non-Arab. So even within that same black, non-black thing, it's more nuanced than that.
What he's referring to, though, we have to know exactly what he's referring to. Because if he's referring to what I think he's referring to, it was a more nuanced discussion. Yes, what I will say to you is that this whole diversion was a diversion that took place as a result of a question that I asked you, which you dodged. And I've been as charitable as possible to you today to try and give you as much answers to your inquiries as possible. You asked me, I asked you originally, where is it in liberalism, principally in philosophical liberalism, that states that racism based on race is something which is unacceptable?
Your conception of philosophical liberalism is something that you've invented by yourself, okay?
No, I
Yes,
haven't
it
said
is.
that.
Yes, it
Why?
is. Yes, it is.
Says the
Because-
guy who doesn't
yes,
even
it
know
is.
his own
Because-
sources.
No, it is because
Why?
like
Why?
because no
Yeah.
people
Yeah,
who
go
are
on.
like
Yeah.
consider themselves liberal today
Yeah.
and who
That's not evidence.
it is an evidence because
That's not evidence.
at best you're talking about something anachronistic, okay?
No, I'm
so
not.
you're
I'm
not
talking
talking
about
about anything.
principles.
You're not talking about
Sorry,
anything
sorry.
that's anything that's
See,
relevant
what
today.
you're-
Anything that's followed today.
You don't
no one
understand what
no
you're
one no one thinks liberalism. That just means that
What
there's a
is
social contract.
you're liberal, you don't even know how to define it. How do you define liberalism?
It refers to a range
Define
of
liberalism.
ideas, doesn't it? So
No,
you
give
can't
me
give
a
it hard
definition.
borders, can you?
Yes, you can.
No, you can't give it hard
liberalism.
borders because any
What
political
does it mean?
ideology is going to have a range, isn't
What
it?
does it mean to be a liberal?
In general,
Yeah.
you can try and characterize it. You can't define it. You can characterize
Go ahead.
it. And some of the characters that you refer to are valid. So, for example,
Yeah.
like the social contract rights, and so or that it violates their freedoms. That if you oppress another person and limit their freedom, you're doing a bad thing, and that people should act in a way like in concordance with each other and arrange deals with each other without like oppressing each other or violating their freedom either by aggression or coercion, things like that. Okay, so these are our other ideas within liberalism. You've like come up with your conception of liberalism that neglects these other ideas within the spectrum.
No, you have not paid attention to the argument. My argument was exactly this. My argument was that all of those human rights that you're referring to, the freedom of the individual and so on, they can be superseded by social contract by virtue of authority decision from the sovereign who's been mandated and given legitimacy by those individuals who have mandated
that says nothing about whether it is good for that to happen or whether that should happen. No, it doesn't.
What's good in liberalism? What's good in liberalism?
It depends, but like one of the things that it does depend because you're talking about a whole school. You're talking about a broad spectrum of ideological political thought. So I'm not the final arbiter of liberalism. I can't draw a dark, narrow border around liberalism. Okay, and so you can only talk about things that are broadly characterized.
What's good?
There are several things that are good. One thing that's good is to kind of not oppress people. Another thing that's good is
oppression?
See, you're just going to go around. You're just going to continue this indefinitely, aren't you?
No, but your worldview needs to be elaborated.
Yeah.
No, this is the thing. You
pointed out something. You pointed out something.
No, here's what I said. My statement. Instead of you answering this, my statement is this: what is good in liberalism is that which is philosophically legitimate according to that philosophy. So, for example,
no, that's not true.
Okay,
disprove me. No, like that. Well, I'm pretty certain that you will not find any kind of. You like to go to like kind of these 200-year-old people. I bet you won't find any kind of liberal philosophy said what is good under liberalism is what is legitimate. Okay, so
no, that's
like,
what John Stuart Mill said actually.
I very much doubt it.
Okay, let's get the book.
Even if he did, you know, he's not.
So now you're going back and forth. Yes or no?
Oh man, James, you're all over the place as usual, man.
Basically, okay.
Serious.
And so
no, it's not what's legitimate.
Yeah. So
it is what's legitimate.
No, I was agreeing with you that no kind of simply what would be considered legitimate doesn't mean what is good. Okay.
That's what he said. Legitimate is what's desirable. He said that something which is good is that which is desirable.
You know,
then he caveated it with the hard
I doubt it, but even if he did,
you doubt it. You don't know. You don't know.
Yeah, that's why I said I doubt rather than I don't know. Okay.
So why are you doubting it? I'm telling you the reference. I'm giving you the book. I'm giving you the thing.
Because I feel okay. I don't follow this. Sure you are.
Yes, you are. It's a religion.
Okay,
It's a religion. All right. I think we're done.
James,
the answer is that you've just like
Have you
created
got
a
one
straw man
answer?
version of liberalism. All that you've done is created a straw man version of liberalism. Yeah, you have. You haven't. You haven't. No,
you don't even know what liberalism is.
You've taken one idea and you've said like kind of, oh, this is liberalism.
James, you've embarrassed yourself once
slavery
again.
isn't bad under
Congratulations.
liberalism.
Nice try.
You're trying very hard to defend slavery. I understand because that's something that Mohammed did and his companions did. Okay. You're saying nice try, but you're trying to do that.
You have no legs to stand on. When it comes to slavery, you have as
So I think now what we discovered that this man, when he was probed on his belief, he used the terms himself: liberalism, secularity, and humanism. When he was probed on it, then he decided to say all those things that he said.
The difference is that I say it's wrong. You say it's maybe okay or it's sometimes okay. Maybe it will be okay in the future. Okay, I can definitely say slavery is wrong. Like, honest Muslims will have to say, oh, maybe it'll be okay in the future. I don't know. Maybe in an ideal Islamic state, slavery will be okay. I don't know.
What your forefathers did is totally.
Obviously.
The term slave. The thing that is common is the word slave. How you guys went about it is hell no to
how was slaves
Don't get me
treated
wrong,
in Iraq in the 9th century?
Exactly. You have no legs to stand on.
He wasn't. Okay, but he hold on.
So then
He made slaves do labor as well.
Sorry, James, I have a question.
He made slaves do labor as well.
You believe in democracy, yeah?
Yeah, to some
okay.
extent, yeah.
So if I were to say to you, right, that what is good from a democratic perspective is that what the majority decides.
Only if you say that your morals come that democracy is a better form of government than having a king, that doesn't mean that they have to kind of follow a democracy when it becomes tyrannical. The idea is to follow morals, not just follow kind of things strictly.
That's right.
Yeah, how about you?